God, we give thanks for this day, for this space and this time to be together. We are gathered today with a very present awareness of how dangerous lies can be, as we've seen the news from the murders in Atlanta last night. Please help us to have eyes that are open and ears that are open to see and to hear the ways that we have been caught up in lies and ways that we have inherited identities that are harmful not only to other people but to us. And to the extent that those have been wrapped up in the language and the symbols of our faith, we pray, God, that you would, by your power, move to set us free and show us the way toward a faithful Christian witness in our time. Amen. Let's see. Let me pull up our slideshow for today. If you were with us last week, we spent some time looking at the racist roots, really, of Christian nationalism and the story of how the myth of a Redeemer nation was very much shaped by the redemption movement and by the sort of a resurgence of a lost cause religion after the Civil War that pushed for white supremacy, and in many ways, as captured by that that sort of cultural symbol, the film "The Birth of a Nation" that we talked about, sort of announces a role, a public role of religion in public life that is explicitly white supremacist at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, what I wanted to talk about was how in the 20th century, Christian nationalism was very much a project that was corporately sponsored in order to build a sort of civic religion and national imagination that would unite people, but certainly not without the complications of race that we already talked about, and other sorts of divisions and otherings that have become an important part of the polarization that we've seen since the latter part of the 20th century. So for today, we're going to look at the story of how corporate America created one nation under God. I wanted to start with a clip from the PBS documentary that just came out on the Black church. I don't know if you got a chance to see it, but I would highly recommend it. It's a long story of the Black church in America, and I just want to show one little clip. But this is an important part of the story of religion in American life that I think it's important for us to understand if we're going to get a handle on why corporations invested so much money in developing a myth of religious nationalism, of Christian nationalism in the 20th century. And it had a lot to do with what's usually called the social gospel when we talk about Christian public witness in American public life. But this is a focus in especially on the conditions out of which the Black social gospel emerged. And while I don't have time to get into it today, the scholars, the religious historians who look back at the social gospel identify similar context, actually an identical context, but different traditions and circumstances out of which the Black and white social gospels emerged. Certainly in white evangelical circles, the white social gospel has been pretty widely dismissed since the latter part of the 20th century, and usually dismissed as a way of reading the gospel that focused on this world and social systems without recognizing a personal relationship with Jesus, without recognizing the need for evangelism, these sorts of things. But as you may already see from the focus we had on the Black church and emerging enslaved churches' critique of slaveholder religion last week, Black Christians have never been very susceptible to that dichotomy, given that dichotomy was very much developed in order to justify their enslavement. The Black social gospel was always very much an embrace of a personal relationship with Jesus, a commitment to the church, a commitment to evangelism, and those personal relationships and that ecclesial context being a center of social engagement. And so from the very good documentary by Henry Louis Gates, this is just a clip introducing the Black social gospel so you can get a feel for that.
Being new migrants, many of them had to work in the most menial of jobs. They were working in factories, they're working as domestics. And in the South, they had rural sort of forms of support where, you know, your neighbor could make sure your son or your daughter was okay, your family was supported. Whereas in the North, you were off at work and nobody was watching your children.
Well, I'm thinking of friends whom I used to know.
Migrants did not have access to minimal services, whether it was healthcare, job employment, right? They would find these things in the church.
I think there is a way in which African-American churches have always assumed a greater responsibility for the lives of their congregants, something greater than simply meeting spiritual needs on Sunday.
Some churches chose to respond almost aggressively. We're really going to make sure these migrants come into our fold. For instance, Olivet Baptist in Chicago started something they called the Bethlehem Baptist Association, specifically to address the material needs of Black Southern migrants, many of whom arrived with nothing.
Out of that commitment to help their own, Black churches built upon the framework broadly known as the social gospel, Christianity's attempt to address social and economic problems, drawing upon the tenets of the Bible to scale these persistent, seemingly unmovable mountains.
This is having a profound impact on churches in terms of the numbers.
And so that's really the beginnings of the megachurch movement. We see multiple megachurches in Chicago, Mount Olivet, Abyssinian in Harlem with 5,000, 10,000 members.
In New York City, Abyssinian's role going into the 20th century with a young gospel giant named Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was certainly responding to a social gospel. He had classes, tailoring, learning how to read. He was working then to cure the ills that were hampering our people. Because as much as people think of the North as the promised land, it was hell up here too.
The reality was Southern migrants saw the same kinds of discrimination. It was difficult to find a job. Housing was crowded. Conditions that made people think that in some ways it was up south and not the kind of transformative promised land that they had imagined.
So what you see there is, in a very real way, the myth of a Redeemer nation that we talked about last week, that was preached from pulpits, that was pushed through, literature like that of Thomas Dixon that we looked at, that became the sort of national myth in the movie The Birth of a Nation. That movie was used as a recruiting tool for the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan in the 19-teens and 20s. And the terrorism that was inspired by that narrative led to scores, hundreds of lynchings every year during that period. The response to that was the Great Migration, right? So Black folks from the South moving to Chicago, moving to New York City, moving to the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest are responding to the conditions that are created by this myth. And their response in the Black social gospel is to live out a faith that very deeply connects faith in Jesus with meeting the real needs of migrants. This is the sort of context out of which the social gospel is born. And it's important to note that, you know, we have folks like Adam Clayton Powell, who was mentioned there, Reverend E. Ransom, who's the great institution builder and theologian, wrote a great deal out of Chicago, William Simmons, a Baptist. If you'd like to read more and dive into the Black social gospel, Gary Dorian has been doing a series of books on the Black social gospel that begins with his volume called The Abolitionist, The New Abolitionist. I mean, there's a very rich resource here in terms of Christianity engaging in public life, and it has a kind of a echo impact on the broader society. Frances Perkins is a woman who went to school in Chicago, and alongside these institutions, there were also institutions connected to predominantly white denominations. She was Episcopalian, and in her church learned about Jane Addams and the Hull House, ended up volunteering at the Hull House, which is sort of one of the early birthplaces of what we now call social work. But these institutions were emerging out of that context of the extreme disparity that existed in these burgeoning urban centers. And out of that, people experienced a kind of faith that demanded justice and real action to meet the needs of people. This is a quote from Perkins. She said, this is about her experience in Chicago as a student. One thing seemed perfectly clear. Our Lord had directed all who were following in his path to visit the widows, the orphans, the fatherless. The circumstances of the life of the people of my generation was my business, and I ought to do something about it. And do something about it she did. She became very involved in politics, was the first woman appointed to a presidential cabinet in Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet. She was the Secretary of Labor. In many ways, she was the architect of the New Deal. This is the Time magazine cover that celebrated her in 1933 as the architect of the New Deal. But Frances Perkins is the woman who, you know, motivated by her faith, by her deep conviction, rooted in that social gospel movement, becomes the, you know, advocate and the architect of Social Security, of a minimum wage, of a government that is, you know, actively working to change the conditions. Because of her influence, no doubt, Roosevelt says that no corporation that doesn't pay a living wage has a right to exist in this country. I mean, imagine somebody saying that sort of thing in politics today. But he was the president of the United States saying this in the 1930s. And so this has a huge impact on public life, and it's all deeply rooted in Christian faith, which leads to a reactionary response. The photo you see here is of a Congregationalist minister from Los Angeles, the Reverend James W. Fifield Jr. He pastored a successful up-and-coming Hollywood-type congregation. As a matter of fact, one of his members was D.W. Griffith, the man who made the movie The Birth of a Nation. He was a member of Fifield's church. And beyond his church, Fifield became very active in the white conservative circles that were determined to resist the New Deal. There were a lot of business people, of course, who did not want to pay a minimum wage, who did not want to see the taxes on their earnings increased in order to pay for social programs. And yet, in the context of the Great Depression, business people had, let's say, limited credibility with the American public. And so they developed a strategy whereby they would, actually they did a survey. They did a survey, paid for a survey to ask Americans who the most trusted people were in their communities. And at that time, preachers came out on top. Preachers were the most trusted people in their communities in the 1930s in the United States. And so actually the National Association of Manufacturers invites Fifield to address them with a proposal for how he could organize pastors across the country in something he called spiritual mobilization, preachers who would preach a pro-capitalist, pro-free market, anti-New Deal message that would persuade people that their Christian and patriotic duty was to stand for individual liberty and to push back against a government that was trying to address the social ills of the Industrial Revolution. And so this is a quote from one of the early pamphlets that he created, which he distributed to 17,000 pastors around the country in the 1930s. America's movement toward dictatorship. He's talking about Franklin Roosevelt. America's movement toward dictatorship has already eliminated checks and balances in its concentration of powers in our chief executive. If with Jesus we believe in the sacredness of individual personalities, then our leadership responsibility is very plain. It was a rally cry to call preachers together. And much of the infrastructure of what would become the Christian nationalism that we know today begins to be built in this era by spiritual mobilization, by parallel organizations that are started by Christian businessmen associations that begin to gather businessmen for prayer groups. Those prayer groups reach out to politicians and begin to have prayer breakfasts and prayer circles in state houses and eventually in Congress through an organization called the Family. It was a movement to baptize a sort of libertarianism, right? A sort of spiritual blessing of the, as he says here, sacredness of individual personalities. This notion that the individual is the key and that any effort to address society or social systems is somehow anti-gospel. Fifield is central in shaping that notion and in spreading it among churches through newsletters, magazines, and a radio program that he develops that eventually includes tens of thousands of pastors in his spiritual mobilization program. Here's a sort of teaching tool that comes out of this movement. Again, it's a partnership between business groups and clergy. And so sometimes these things were put out to local business people. Sometimes it was put out to local clergy. Sometimes they were doing things together. But this is a sort of illustration of the vision that they wanted to popularize, the credo of the American way of life. You see at the bottom, to maintain the American way of life and pass it intact to succeeding generations is the responsibility of every true American, right? So there's this appeal to patriotism. There's this appeal to national unity, and the foundation of it all is this claim that the fundamental belief in God is what the nation rests upon, right? So you see the myth of Christian nationalism that we talked about the first week being spelled out here as a kind of firm foundation on which these values that people want to both celebrate and promote are based. The constitutional government designed to serve the people, and then all of these rights that they put on top of these. Of course, you know, some of these rights are things that sound quite reasonable, right? The right to the service of government as a protector and referee, right to a freedom. There's lots of liberty language, lots of freedom language, but also notice that the language of freedom from government begins to be introduced. The notion that the government can be overbearing. This is interestingly, Nancy McLean has done some of this work in her book, Democracy Unchained. This notion of liberty as freedom from government, what in the 20th century would be called states' rights, right? That the, you know, when people say that the Constitution guarantees rights of states a right to freedom from the federal government, that notion of liberty was worked out in the 19th century very much by Senator Calhoun from South Carolina, who led the charge for secession. This notion that, you know, liberty means essentially freedom for plantation owners to do what they want without the federal government getting involved. That's the sort of theoretical basis of this argument that's being made, but it's being made here very much in a popular way, directed toward a notion of uniting the country around God and liberty. And pamphlets like this were very much a part of the program that that Fifield organized for preachers and that business groups sponsored around the country. And this leads pretty much directly to the enthusiasm and sponsorship of Billy Graham's ministry by corporate influences in the mid 20th century. I think this background is really critical to understanding why people with money were so enthusiastic about the ministry of Billy Graham. If, like me, you know, you're a Southerner, you grew up in Southern churches, you probably understand that the message of Billy Graham was never very exceptional. You know, he preached a sort of individual salvation gospel that most Baptist preachers of his generation preached. He was particularly photogenic, and I think, especially as a young person, particularly energetic in front of the camera. But what he had to say wasn't all that exceptional. I think what this movement did recognize is that his willingness to connect that with a kind of service to the nation created the opportunity for this binding nationalism in the mid 20th century that that so many people were hoping would unite a majority of Americans behind free market principles, what the historian Kevin Kruse has called Christian libertarianism. And as it happens, I think the advent of his crusades, right at the moment when in international affairs, the United States was very much engaging in, you know, this post-Second World War Cold War with communist forces, created the opportunity for Billy Graham to be a sort of national pastor, national evangelist for this kind of Christian libertarianism. Here's a little clip that pulls together some of the sort of standard lines he used in that era in a way that I think will help you see how they saw his message as really serving this agenda that we were talking about before.
What's wrong with the world? I think every one of us tonight agrees that something is terribly wrong with the world in which we live. This program is being seen tonight live in Little Rock. And today in Little Rock, Arkansas, they had a booth. which illustrates racial tension that is sweeping the nation, not only in the South, but other parts of the nation as well. Why do we have these tensions in life? Why do we have these explosive problems in every generation? We also recognize that we may be on the verge of war in the Far East, a war of nuclear weapons that could destroy even civilization itself. What's wrong? What's happened? What's wrong with man? What's wrong with the world in which we live? The race problem is a symptom. War is a symptom. Crime is a symptom. Sociological problems are symptoms. There is something deeper wrong. All of these things are symptoms. What is the cause? Well, the Bible says that man has a disease. And that disease is called S-I-N, sin. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is what is wrong with the world tonight. Man's nature is wrong side up. Man's nature has a disease. And this disease from within, said Jesus in our passage, produces all of these evil things that when you put them together collectively, they produce war and social tension. Jesus said these things come from inside the man. Now that is where communism and Christianity have a headlong clash. Because Karl Marx looked at the problems of the world and he said something's wrong. And Karl Marx said that the problem of the world is social. He said, you solve the social problems of the world and man will be a happy individual. And we can build a utopia on earth. We can build a heaven on earth. But Jesus said, you're wrong. He said the problem of the world is not social. The social problems are only symptoms of a deeper problem. The problem of the world is not illiteracy, the fact that millions cannot read and write. The problems of the world are not summed up in poverty. It's not because there are have-not nations and have nations. It's not social injustice, as bad as that may be, that is the heart of the problem. There's something deeper, said Jesus. He said our problems originate from within. And he called it S-I-N, sin. And ladies and gentlemen, the problem of the world tonight is sin.
So there you have it. The gospel is framed as the alternative in this presentation to Karl Marx. Not the best summary of Karl Marx I've ever heard, but nevertheless, you see the distinction, right? That Marx here as a symbol of any attempt to address social issues or systemic injustice is the very alternative to Jesus. And Jesus, in Graham's framing, is concerned about the individual and the individual's decision, which becomes very tied to patriotism and to a sense that the government of the United States, the good democratic government, is founded on this kind of religious commitment to individual liberty. That is the Christian nationalism that Graham simply assumed, and that his corporate sponsors became very enthusiastic about. And so the Crusade program that he, had developed out of the Southern Revival model that, was just sort of the normal Christian experience he knew growing up, but was very much a product of much of what we talked about last week. This becomes a nationally, the newspaper in LA that first sort of made him famous, the owner of the newspaper said to the editors that their directive was to puff Graham, right? Really build him up. And increasingly, there was more and more buy-in to this. And an intentional effort to connect this with a government that very much celebrated this Christian nationalism as a means of building unity. We get that very much in Dwight Eisenhower. So this is Eisenhower speaking to the Chamber of Commerce when he was president. If we keep in sight the underlying aspiration of all America to continue to grow under the blessings of Almighty God with the tremendous opportunities that have been ours because of, there it is again, individual liberty, as long as we cooperate together for the common good, we cannot lose. We simply cannot lose. The caveat there is really interesting. Eisenhower seemed to recognize the danger of taking individual liberty too far, right? As long as we cooperate together for the common good. But there was mid-20th century a great confidence, a bipartisan confidence, that this kind of Christian nationalism could bring people together and could lead to cooperation for the common good. It led to the, as you see in the picture here, the "In God We Trust" being stamped on the money. That's a legislative action that happens under Eisenhower's administration, as well as the "One Nation Under God" being added to the National Pledge of Allegiance. And so this language of Christian nationalism, in many ways, the sort of cultural architecture of the myth is introduced and corporately sponsored in the 20th century as a way of attempting to build national unity, and in particular, mid-20th century, to build national unity over and against communism, right? This alternative that's being explored in the USSR, and that is framed as the principal threat to U.S. interests in the world, is framed as an anti-God form of government, whereas the free market capitalism of the United States is presented as God's very plan. We can indeed put God's name on the money now, and that's what happens in actual fact. What is the impact of Christian libertarianism? It would take a while to go through all of the ways this narrative that we're sketching gets tied to policy, but I thought one chart could help us look at the impact. This is a chart of income inequality over the past 100 years. So we have data beginning in about 1913, and then coming up to the present. The chart flow, what the chart actually shows, you can see there on the left-hand column, the share of national income received by the top 1%, right? So we began here in pretty much what we refer to in history as the Gilded Age, right? That period when the early industrialists were making money hand over fists, when they were, building resorts in St. Augustine and Palm Beach, and when we had this sort of Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age because everybody wanted to demonstrate their wealth, wanted to make it gold and shiny. Big buildings, big cars, flashy clothes. And at that time, we see the chart begin with the richest people having the highest concentration of wealth. Well, the social gospel that we were talking about and the policies of the New Deal era were very much an attempt to push back against that in order to have a greater distribution of the nation's wealth among all the people. And you can see that those policies did have a real impact over time, right? So the policies that are passed in the 1930s and 40s, of course, the impact of policy is always somewhat beyond when it's actually passed. But you can see that it continues on a trend that really goes all the way through the mid-60s, 1970s. In some ways, and we'll talk about this a little more next week, the story of Christian libertarianism and its effort to take power in government is not fully completed until Richard Nixon's administration. And so it's striking to see that in the aftermath of his administration and the Reagan administration, which is very much in the same pattern, you see the gains of the previous several decades immediately diminish on the other side, right? So this is a chart that in some ways helps us look at how narratives like this and the way those narratives support policies have real impact on everyday people, to the point where today, where we are, at least where this chart stops when the data stops around 2017, I think, we have income inequality that is as high as it has ever been since the Gilded Age. These stories do have a real impact on real people. It's why today there's not a single county in the United States where a family of 4 can rent a 2-bedroom apartment with parents working at the minimum wage. That's the kind of reality that people face because of this disparity. So to conclude today, every week we're trying to come back to Scripture and to ask what the Scriptures offer us in terms of a response to the impact of this Christian nationalist narrative. I thought today, particularly because we're thinking about the ways that corporate interests have influenced this narrative and the ways that corporations have benefited from this narrative. Isaiah's word to the nation in Isaiah chapter 10 is important. You remember the first week we looked at the warning, the warning that if you have a king, the king will treat you like the other nations, God says to the people through Samuel. Well, in many ways, the testimony of the prophets is a testimony to, exactly what impact that has. The prophets always go to the kings and tell the kings how their policies are impacting the people. And that's what Isaiah does in chapter 10, with a particular emphasis on the economic impact. He says, "Doom to all of you who legislate evil, who make laws that make victims." I think a passage like this is especially important for Christians who have been steeped in the kind of extreme dichotomy that Billy Graham was articulating in that clip we saw today, right? This extreme dichotomy between, Christ's word to the individual and what Karl Marx says about the nation. If you take that dichotomy at face value, it makes it very difficult to read a passage like this. And there are lots of passages like it in Scripture. God speaks through the prophets to nations, to you who legislate evil. Now, granted, there are no democracies in the ancient world, but whoever makes the laws, whether it's a democratically elected Congress or whether it's a king or a king's court, Isaiah pronounces doom on those who pass laws that make victims. And he's very specific: laws that make misery for the poor and that rob my destitute people of dignity, exploiting defenseless widows, taking advantage of homeless children. God is concerned about these things, Isaiah says. These things matter. What will you have to say on Judgment Day? When doomsday arrives out of the blue, who will you go to get help? What good will your money do you? A sorry sight you'll be then, huddled with the prisoners, or just some corpses stacked in the street. The prophet doesn't mince words. Policy does have impact, and God cares about the impact of policy, because it impacts people. I think a prophetic word like that is an important counter to the extreme dichotomy of the Bible's word to individuals versus the Bible's word about systems and social structures that we have inherited because of this corporately sponsored Christian nationalism that we're looking at today. So I'll stop there and open it up for your thoughts and your comments. If you'd like to jump in, just unmute yourself. And
I don't see any comments in the chat box, so.
well, thanks for watching that. Maybe somebody.
If I get out of this, will I still see you? I brought up all the participants again, and I don't want to go away from the meeting.
Oh, you can't see us?
I can see the names.
Oh, well, let's just close that.
Close it?
Yeah, don't want you to miss us.
It says leave meeting.
Oh, no, don't leave the meeting. Sorry.
I don't know how to get out of here. Let's see, maybe if no, it didn't work.
I'll just do that. That work for you?
No.
Oh, sorry.
I'll leave the meeting and you can let me back in.
Okay, do that. Do that. How about for others? Thoughts, comments? Anne has a comment here that says, at what point do you see the Christian nationalist movement getting directly involved in local electoral politics? I'm so glad you're here, Anne, because you're a great authority on this.
Okay.
And I think oh, there you are. Good to see you. So for any of you who don't know, Anne has done a lot of good research on an organization called the Council for National Policy. And they really play a central role in what happens when this Christian nationalist narrative that we've been sketching becomes a very directly allied with the Republican Party. And I mean, nailing down the exact date, people might argue on, but it happens more or less, when the new right is trying to respond to the real gains of the civil rights and the women's rights movement, right? So it happens as those folks who see the larger electorate, the more diverse electorate, not continuing the policy agenda that was serving their interests. And so in the mid-1970s, most of the organizations that make that movement possible emerge. And
we have a pivot from the
please, yeah.
Dixiecrats to the Republicans, and then this kind of gradual inroad to change the definition of Republicans in a lot of, it's like injecting the Republican Party with the Dixiecrat ethos.
Yeah.
And I have to wonder whether Jimmy Carter, being an unusual Southern Baptist Democrat, might have been part of that switch.
It's a good question. I mean, I think if we're going to be honest about the role of Christian nationalism, we got to be clear that what we're talking about today was mostly very bipartisan. It was very white, but it was very bipartisan. And it's precisely because of the commitments that Democrats in power made to the demands of the civil rights movement that the Republican Party becomes the party of white people. And I think, I mean, Jimmy Carter is one figure who, could be a good white Southerner and a Democrat before, but after this, after this shift, it becomes impossible to have a base for that kind of politics anymore.
Thank you.
There is a chat here from Andre. I'm not sure I'm saying your name right. Do you
Andre.
Andre, okay.
Hi, Andre. You want to ask the question or?
Well, I just wonder why there isn't a stronger movement to get behind the Poor People's Campaign among mainstream churches. And is it because the name of the movement doesn't speak to the demographic that populates at least the Protestant mainstream churches?
Well, that's a good question. So what you're asking about is, to my knowledge, the broadest attempt to challenge religious nationalism in the country today is the Poor People's Campaign. It explicitly calls itself a national call for moral revival and has identified religious nationalism in the way it's connected to systemic poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, and the war economy as the kind of injustice, the sort of constellation of injustices that are interlocking and that we face as a nation. You know, I'm very involved in the Poor People's Campaign, and I would love to see more people involved. But I'll have to say, as a student of the Poor People's Campaign of the 1960s, I've been encouraged that there are 19 national religious denominations that are officially endorsing today's Poor People's Campaign. So the Episcopal Church USA, the Presbyterian Church USA, the largest congregation of Jewish communities in the country, a national Muslim organization. There are many religious denominations that have endorsed the campaign. I shouldn't forget the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which was the first national denomination to endorse the campaign. But yet, I think you're absolutely right that there are many churches and many Christians that would not get behind something like this. And I think it has everything to do with the narrative that we were talking about today, right? There has been so much invested in framing Christianity, American Christianity, as primarily a concern about individuals, right? And oftentimes in more fundamentalist and evangelical circles, that focus has been on, individuals, sort of, eternal salvation, the status of the individual after they die. But in white mainline circles, much of that has also focused on sort of individual sort of therapeutic spirituality, individual well-being, the well-being of families. A lot of the church's focus has been on sort of, caring for our own. Both of those fit within that framing that we were looking at today, and I think neglect the social responsibility, the social witness of the church. What the social gospel of the early 20th century, both Black and white, was trying to push on. And so, whatever critiques may be offered about what the white social gospel may have neglected or left out, I think it's a strong reason why churches don't immediately see the connection between the prophetic text and the prophetic witness of the church with a kind of public witness like the Poor People's Campaign. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of recovering that aspect of what it means to be a Christian.
I couldn't agree more. I have the feeling that people in the circles that I'm in don't want to get their hands dirty, unfortunately, as well-intentioned as they may otherwise be.
Yeah, but the reality is our hands are dirty. our
very
faith,
dirty.
Our faith is out there on display in in defense of as we talked about the first week. I mean, our faith is out there on display, being used to rally people for insurrection. If we're not inviting people into some alternative, then we're sort of, silently sitting by while others lead a so-called Christian crusade for their own agenda.
Yeah, and I think the way that you summarized the platform of the Poor People's Campaign as including environmental desecration or environment, just exploitation of all kinds of things is the answer really to the kind of corporate endorsement of Christian nationalism that you were talking about. So I really do hope that that can be promoted.
Well, one other reason I would commend Anne's work to you all is that she has shown how so much of the modern infrastructure of the so-called Christian right of Christian nationalism has been funded by oil interests, right? So it's oil money that has created this notion that this is Christianity, that this is the dominant Christianity. This is no accident, just as we were talking about. I mean, slaveholder religion was sponsored by the people who owned the plantations in the 19th century. And they paid the people to write those books, to write those tracts, to preach those sermons. In the same way, the oil interests have funded these, think tanks that are at Christian universities, these parachurch organizations, these groups that send you free literature all the time. I mean, in some ways, everyone has to take responsibility for the way in which we have accepted and believed things we've been told. But we also have to acknowledge that a lot more money has been invested in these lies than has been invested in an honest, assessment of what does the Bible actually say. And so, I think you're right. The interest of oil money and the way in which people whose own scientists told them that climate change was a major issue in the early 1980s, and yet they invested in essentially propaganda that would create an alternative reality by using religion. That's a big part of this story. We'll look at that some next week as we bring this history up to the present. Someone asked here, it said,
William.
Yeah, would you like to ask that, or you want me to read it?
I think you said read it.
Okay. It says, I'm particularly frightened by Franklin Graham's power in the politics of Christian nationalism. Billy Graham seems to have softened in his approach to social ills as he aged, but his son continues to irritate and condemn the appropriate response to social problems by followers of Christ. Well, I couldn't agree more that Brother Franklin Graham, who's my neighbor here in North Carolina, is certainly a leader among those who are proudly championing Christian nationalism today. I think an honest assessment of his father's trajectory is that as a younger man, as we saw him in the clip today, he was kind of in the same place for his time, right? The politics were a little different, but he was very much an advocate of Christian nationalism and willing to be the bridge between that base and first Eisenhower, later Nixon. It is also true that Graham chose not to involve himself in the organizing efforts that we'll talk about next week of the moral majority and the infrastructure of the religious right that emerged after that. I think he did that because he understood that Nixon had used him for his own political ends, and he wanted to distance himself from that, I think both for reasons of personal integrity and for the sake of his own evangelistic ministry. So I'll give him credit for that. However, Graham has no such scruples. He's full in, and he uses his father's organization to rally people for Christian nationalism. He does it very much in sync with the election cycles. His prayer rallies at the capitals were essentially an arm of the Trump campaign in 2016. He did them again for the midterms in 2018, and he did something similar in focused states in 2020. We had a very close presidential race here in North Carolina. I think if Donald Trump is honest, he should give Franklin Graham credit for his carrying North Carolina, because Graham went city to city in North Carolina and rallied people for the cause of reelecting Donald Trump.
All right, we've got two more questions, one from Patrick Messer and one from Ann Nelson again. Patrick, do you want to say?
Sure. Sure. Well, first I'll just mention Reverdy Ransom that was mentioned earlier. His grandson lives in Durham, which is really interesting. Great guy. But I wanted to say, or just ask, do you think that this critique of Christian nationalism, going back all the way to the Southern plantation and the way that fueled the Industrial Revolution, King Cotton, going all the way to the 20th century, and this corporate sponsorship of one nation under God, is there this critique of Christian nationalism in that history? I mean, does that entail sort of a fundamental critique of capitalism itself, or can we critique Christian nationalism and not touch capitalism necessarily?
Well, sure, it's a critique of capitalism, simply to the extent that that is the system, that we are responding to, that we're responding to the realities of. That's frankly, an honest reading of Karl Marx, from the 19th century on up to the present, is that he's simply offering a Hegelian critique of capitalism. Right? He just believes that, as a 19th century Hegelian thinker, he just believes that any thesis has an antithesis, and that leads to something. That might not be your philosophy, but it was his. So he, out of that, he begins to imagine what a critique of the capitalist system offers in terms of pushing towards something new. That has not, in every context, led to something better. But let's be honest, there are, at the same time that there are Christians in the United States who are working with corporate interests to essentially, create this Christian libertarianism, there are also Christians in social democratic countries that are imagining, a sort of Christian social democracy. That's what shapes much of Europe. The same movement that was happening here during the New Deal was happening in the Scandinavian countries. In the Scandinavian countries, the policies won out, and created a very different kind of understanding about what the government's responsibility is to its citizens. And so, so I guess I'm saying you don't have to be some kind of radical anti-capitalist to say that, capitalism is the system that we have. The system that we have has obvious problems because, there are people who are hurting. And in whatever system we live within, Christians have to be concerned with people who are hurting. So I think that calls us to be critical and to address the issues that are hurting people. And that's why I wanted to end today just by taking a brief look at income inequality. It seems to me it's an obvious result of this narrative. And, if you know any poor people, it's pretty clear that it's a result that's hurting poor people. In the richest nation in the world, to me, it's just a sin, and a sin that we've too readily accepted, that people who work all week can't afford to live. But thank you for asking. Before we wrap up here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, everybody should read Ann Nelson's.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're pointing out here, thank you, this Charlie Kirk is one of the people who is being sponsored right now to try to promote a Christian nationalist narrative among the churches. And yeah, he's starting a group that's going to be reaching out to. So you may find, particularly some of your young people, asking about this organization, Turning Point Faith, which has a lot of money from people who have interest in maintaining the system as it exists, and they will be reaching out to churches ahead of the coming midterms, trying to build a youth movement for God, guns, and country. It's usually the theme. And so be on the lookout for that. We're going to look next week much more at all of the sort of constellation of organizations that are coordinating this work today and the impact that it's having on this narrative as it exists in the present. But thanks for being here today, and I'll see you next Wednesday.